We've looked at a lot of the basics of the faith, in particular, who was Jesus Christ? What did his crucifixion mean? What did it do for us? What is the significance of the resurrection? Given that these things are not just academic matters, but these are matters to believe in personally, what do you do when you've done that? What happens when you've accepted Jesus as the crucified, risen Savior, literally? Well, traditionally, through the years and in the Bible, the next step is baptism. And today we're going to talk about what's the proper mode of baptism, who receives baptism, and what's the significance of baptism. Well, hello again. Phil and I are here to discuss biblical theological matters, and today we're looking at baptism. Baptism is it's a hard topic to discuss. On the one hand, virtually every Christian denomination practices some form of baptism for some reason. At the same time, these reasons vary greatly. There has been contention about baptism over the years. And the group that's been cited as being the most troublesome, most contentious, has been the Baptists. And that's because Baptists have practiced and sometimes required a rebaptism. Baptists have not recognized infant baptisms, and that's been a problem. So we're going to explore the topic of baptism today. We're going to look at the three main questions, as I said before. The proper mode of baptism, how should people be baptized? The proper recipients or candidates for baptism, who should be baptized? And then the significance of baptism, why be baptized? So first, the point of the mode of baptism. And there have been debates about that over the centuries. Baptists baptized by complete immersion. You get fully dunked underwater and brought back up. Whereas some denominations practice pouring or effusion, and some practice sprinkling, just a little bit on the forehead. Now, scholars across the board, regardless of denomination, all pretty much agree that the early church practiced immersion, that they fully immersed their candidates, and there are several reasons for this. The first one is that the word baptize originally meant to dye fabric. You would dip the fabric in the dye and let it sit there for a while and then bring it back out. So it meant to fully immerse the subject.
I wonder how they got that word.
That is a good question. I've never done the full etymology before.
Yeah. I mean, bap. I can see ties kind of sounds like, well, actually it doesn't really sound like anything except for ties.
It's a verb ending.
Yeah.
So yeah, I've never done the etymology behind baptism.
Maybe some guy named Bap and he dips things, so I'm baptizing. Yeah.
Could be. But the original term was a term used for dyeing. The second thing is baptism is related to the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. We'll talk about that more in section 3, but certainly death, burial, resurrection is symbolized by immersion and bringing you back up out of the water. Now, for the next section, I'd like to have Phil read Matthew 3:16.
3:16. As soon as Jesus was baptized, he went up out of the water. At that moment, heaven was opened, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and lighting on him.
Very good. So Jesus is just one example of someone being baptized, and he was baptized in the Jordan River by John. He went into the Jordan River. When baptism in the New Testament is described in some detail, there's always a significant sized body of water nearby. For Jesus, it was the Jordan River. All of John's subjects were were baptized in the Jordan River. And really, in Jewish tradition, flowing water was the best place to be baptized. They called it living water. And so it symbolized the life-giving quality that baptism signified. Now, the next point also contained in that reading is that language surrounding baptism certainly implies full immersion, full participation in the water. Jesus came up out of the water. Sometimes it talks about a baptismal candidate, in particular the Ethiopian in Acts 8, that he went down into the water, was baptized, and came up out of the water. They didn't just stand by the side and have John pour some on them. They were in the river. Now, granted, I've seen examples of people who would go into water waist high and then have water poured over them, and that later was a method of baptism. But the most logical explanation for walking into the river or into a large body of water is that you were going to be immersed in it. It's not required to be immersed or to walk into the water if it's just going to be poured over you. But if you're going to be dunked, you got to be in the water. Now, another reason that people believe that baptism was originally immersion was that in Jewish history, in Jewish religious customs, they also practiced different kinds of washings for purification reasons. That the Old Testament is very filled, is full of examples where, for instance, priests always had to bathe, they always had to wash, fully immerse themselves in clean water, fresh water, before performing their duties at the temple. Also, at the time of Jesus,
By priests, you mean rabbis?
Well, no, a priest was someone that ministered in the temple.
Okay, so it's not a Christian specific thing.
Not in the Old Testament, no.
Okay.
No, there weren't any Christians yet.
Right.
So they were coming, but weren't there yet.
Right.
And actually, that starts back in Exodus when the law is still given, or was first given. So there are examples of full immersion for purification purposes. In the time of the New Testament, or just before, about 1st century BC, 1st century AD, probably starting in the 3rd century BC, they developed something called a mikvah, which was a large tub, if you will, a large sort of cistern that you would fill with water. And it was developed for ceremonial cleansing, not just for priests, but for everyone. And also it was used to initiate people into the covenant of the Jewish people. In other words, the mikvah made non-Jews Jewish, that initiation process.
So they did have their own kind of version.
They did.
Yeah.
Yes, they did. The significant difference, though, is that a mikvah could be repeated, whereas a baptism, for the most part, is done once for all. But still, it was a form of complete immersion, and there are some sources that refer to it as baptism, suggesting that even in the 1st century, it was referred to as a baptism. So if there's already a term being used, it seems unlikely that the Christian community would take that term, radically redefine it, and start using it. It seems more likely that they would attach a new significance to a common word, an understandable word. And when John was baptizing, nobody walked by him and saying, "What's he doing in there? What is that?" People acted like they understood what baptism was. There's another final reason that immersion seems to be the preferred method or the most correct method of the early church. There is an early work called the Dedic, which means the teaching. And it's a 2nd century set of instructions to how to administer the faith, how to run a church, basically. Or it's an early book on theology. Basically, it's a work that developed because the apostles, disciples, the first generation that knew Jesus, they were dying off. And they had to have some sort of reliable way of passing on the faith and the instructions. And so the Didache was developed. And in chapter 7 of the Didache, it talks about baptism. And it says that indeed the preferred way to baptize is to fully immerse someone in flowing water or living water. That's something somewhat new, that's something additional. We don't have that specific instruction in the New Testament, but given the fact that Jesus said that he is the living water, and in the Old Testament, God is often referred to as a source of living water, it makes sense. It's part of the symbolism. So again, the Didache says, first and foremost, the best way to baptize is to immerse them in flowing water. And then it goes on to talk about if circumstances necessitate, if it's not possible to immerse them either because of circumstances or medical reasons, then you can pour. Then you can take water and just pour it over their head. Sprinkling didn't really develop until the 2nd, maybe 3rd century. So first came immersion, then came pouring. And so Baptists have baptized since their beginning in about the 16th century, sorry. They were first called Anabaptists because Anabaptists meant rebaptizers. And as I said before, the Anabaptists did not accept infant baptism. More about that later.
Except as in, say it was an actual baptism. They might have still done it.
For
infants?
Well, the hallmark of the Anabaptist and the Baptist church is having a believer's church. And as we're going to see, baptism is it's an identification with the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus.
Right.
It's a personal belief and an application of that.
Right, and whereas an infant really can't
understand
that.
Right.
Yeah.
Can't think abstractly yet.
Right.
So, early church or the Anabaptists would not have done that.
So they wouldn't do it at all. So
Wouldn't do it at all.
Wasn't like a dedication or something like that, whatever we call it now.
Yeah, well, we call it a dedication.
Right.
And I have no problem being a little bit creative to maintain family peace that we dedicate and pour a little water while we're dedicating. But I never use the word baptism.
Okay.
Although for a lot of people, if the baby's forehead doesn't get wet, it doesn't count. And I just want to keep peace, and it does symbolize something else, the cleansing, saving act of God. So those are the reasons that Baptists baptize by full immersion. Next, we're going to take a look at who are the candidates, who are the ones who are appropriate recipients of that.